Zoom. Our guest this evening, Strober. Becca. Thank you. Becca was born and raised in Philadelphia. Becca made Aliyah in 2008 and joined the Israel Defense Forces, where she served as a shooting instructor for infantry soldiers between 2008 and 2010. Becca holds a master's degree in political communication from Tel Aviv University, and she has done organizing work around and educated on social and political issues since leaving the Army, specializing in political education and joint Arab-Jewish education. Becca joined Breaking the Silence in 2018 and certainly serves as senior manager. Breaking the Silence, as we all know, is an organization of veteran soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces who have taken it upon themselves to reveal to the Israeli public the full reality of everyday life in the occupied territories. They seek to stimulate public debate about the price paid for a situation in which young soldiers face a civilian population on a daily basis and are engaged in the control of that population's everyday life. Their work aims to bring an end to the occupation. In terms of our hosting this group here at Temple Micah this evening, our last two Micah trips to Israel spent a day touring Hebron with representatives from Breaking the Silence, and these sessions were, I don't want to say inspiring, deeply sobering and eye-opening about the situation in Israel. Thank you so much, dear friend. Okay, Zoom request, okay. I am very proud that our Micah community are strong supporters of this courageous organization. I'm truly honored that Becca is with us this evening. We have note cards if you want to. We're going to do the question. Yeah, thank you, Dan. So you can all hear me now on Zoom, so I've just gotten two signals. The questions are going to be in the session in terms of taking a note card, and you'll be able to pass it in for questions, and people on the Zoom can put it into the chat box. But as we like to say, as a way of encouraging people to come in person, if you're here in person, you get a preference for your question. So remember that next time you Zoom, folks, but do put them into the chat box. Our topic this evening is From Hebron to Tel Aviv, how the Israeli legal overhaul, like the occupation, starts in the West Bank. Becca, thank you so much for being with us.
Okay. I'm going to move this like this way, and then just let me know if there's like an issue. Okay. Oh, I'm going to do...
You don't have to speak into us when you tell us how you're moving it that way.
Right. Okay, so hi, my name's Becca Strober. I'm a senior manager with Breaking the Silence. It's really great to be here. I'm originally from Philly, so I don't have an Israeli accent. I hope that that's not going to be disappointing for our experience this evening. I swear I have citizenship, and I really am Israeli, and you can ask my family because they say I've become very rude when I come to the US, but I'm just Israeli. So every time that I've come and given a talk in DC, more into the mic, okay. So every time I've come to DC and done a talk here, I find that you all in DC really follow what's going on. It kind of makes sense. You live in DC. I'm sure you're all very political people. So I want to do just like a kind of subject check to help me think about how deep we should get into things and how much we can kind of go over some issues. So first of all, just kind of give a hand raise if you've been to Israel. Okay, and then give a hand raise if you've been to the West Bank. Okay, give a hand raise if you've been to the West Bank on some sort of political tour. Breaking the Silence would be included, but also others, right? Not just if you've been on, there's Encounter, there's a bunch of options. We're certainly not the only ones in the field. Okay, raise your hand if you've been with us to Hebron or the South Hebron Hills. Okay, so we're pretty good. So the definition of occupation, right? Does something, we'll say it all together in a second, but like, does something come to mind? Raise your hand if the answer is yes. Okay, a map of the West Bank. Okay, great. Okay, so who's been kind of reading what's been going on in Israel and in the West Bank as of the past couple of months? Okay, so pretty much everyone. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now. We have what the government and right wing is calling a legal reform that's trying to happen. Yeah, we have protests, and the protesters on that side are calling it a legal overhaul. Yeah, these are pretty big moments that are happening inside of the country right now. You have kind of like these weekly protests that are happening, and there's been some weeks where those weekly protests have been daily protests. And without getting in too much to all of the details of the overhaul, it's also not my general focus as a profession, but the basic idea is that why most people who are against it are calling it an overhaul is that the idea behind this legal changes would be to weaken the courts, right? And then basically we would get rid of the checks and balances in the country, right? That's the main critique of it. And these protests that are going on are trying to make changes, or trying to basically keep the legal system as is, or even to an extent looking to perhaps make some legal changes, but not in the way that the overall is currently kind of we're going towards it, right? Hard to say if it's gonna happen or not. Okay. But at Breaking the Silence, we focus on what's going on in the West Bank. And so kind of raise your hand maybe if you've been reading what's going on a little bit in the West Bank in the past month or two. Okay, so there's been some really extreme situations in the West Bank as of recently. Yeah, just in the last week, there's been over 10 pogroms, right? So there's been over 10 attacks towards Palestinians in which either someone was harmed or some sort of property was harmed. Yeah, there's been the last time I checked, which was yesterday morning, so it could have changed since then, 9 outposts, which is basically a settlement. As an American, it doesn't really matter if it's an outpost or a settlement, it's the same thing, okay? 9 new outposts that have been built over the past 6 days. But the last time I checked, that was yesterday. So I'm not totally up to date. And when I checked, and it was 8 the day before that, yeah? And there's been some really big incursions into places like Jenin by our military. About 2 weeks ago, our military, for the first time since the Second Intifada, so it's the first time since the early 2000s, used an aerial strike on the Palestinian of Jenin, which is a huge Palestinian city in the northern part of the West Bank. It's a pretty massive development, right? I don't know exactly what's going to happen with it, but it's a pretty big development. And another major thing that happened, in addition to all of the terror attacks we've been seeing coming from Palestinians towards Israelis, of which that number has been growing, increasing over the past weeks and months and last few years, but also from Jenin recently, just a few days ago, there was a rocket that was attempted to be kind of like we know from Gaza, from Jenin into Israel. It ended up landing in open fields. But as we can see, I'm just kind of setting the stage for us because this moment, like, it's very, very difficult to know exactly how it's going to play out. We really are in a moment of uncertainty. And I think everyone, from the most average of citizen, regardless of where they stand politically, if they agree with the things I'm gonna say, if they don't agree, they feel it. Up until I'm quite positive, though I've never sat down and had coffee with Netanyahu, I'm sure he feels it too, right? I mean, there's a real genuine uncertainty on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. And I would say that a lot of the uncertainty that we're seeing today is born in the situation in the West Bank, okay? So I'm gonna talk a little bit about today how we function in the West Bank. For some of us who have been in Hebron with us, some of this is gonna sound familiar, but hopefully it will give a little bit new information and also a reminder, if you were with us, of what you learned. I don't think you can, I mean, I think you can do it a bunch of times and learn new stuff. And I'm gonna end this talk kind of taking a little bit of a look of how we deal as the army, or really, as the state, with protests in the West Bank. And then that'll bring us back to these protests that are happening right now in Israel over this overhaul, which seemingly doesn't necessarily have to do with the occupation, but of course in our analysis, we can't quite separate it. right? You don't have to agree with me. There'll be plenty of time for conversation afterwards, but we can jump into it. Sound good? Fantastic. Okay. So I'll just say really quickly about myself, since I'm going to be talking to the next 45 minutes. My name is Becca. I was raised in Philly. I moved to Israel in 2007 and made Aliyah officially in 2008. In 2006, I had been on the Reform Movement's high school in Israel. I grew up in a very Zionist household. I grew up in a household that was very pro the two-state solution. I belonged to the largest Reform synagogue in Philadelphia, Rodef Shalom, and my dad was the president there for a long time, or I guess like however long you can be a president of a synagogue, which at Rodef Shalom is 5 years, so he was the president for 5 years. But it was really a very, very active part of my life, and I think probably unsurprising considering we're all sitting in Temple Micah right now with, I'm sure, a lot of the same values. I really grew up on values of not just tradition, but also things like tikkun olam. And I think a lot of the values that today we're fighting over in this overhaul protests, right, that we view as democratic, for me, they're first and foremost Jewish. And that's always been very clear to me. That's like the one kind of messaging I grew up with. The other is that my family is from Jerusalem. My grandmother is a Jerusalemite. My family came over to Jerusalem in 1809. We were some of the first Ashkenazi Jews to settle outside of the old city walls of Jerusalem, the Rivlin family. And my family, I have some family members who survived the massacre in Hebron in 1929, and they weren't originally part of the Zionist movement because they moved to Jerusalem and some to Hebron before the Zionist movement was created. But through different kind of political developments at the time, my family not only became involved in the Zionist movement, but very involved in the Lehi and the Etzel, which are the two pre-state militias that really loved violence. I think all militias kind of like violence, but my family really loved it. And so my family are huge supporters of Jabotinsky, revisionist Zionism, and I grew up with some of my family members having pictures of Jabotinsky on the wall and growing up with heroic stories about how members of my family helped blowing up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And I was proud of that. If I'm being honest, still kind of am. But what I got from my family there was not just, I didn't take just from it the violence, which I think probably even then I was a bit unsure of and a bit critical about, but what I did understand from them was there has to be a place where the Jewish people can be safe and where we can flourish. And so when you take what I learned from my Reform synagogue and you take what I learned from my family stories, which I think a lot of people see as two totally different political movements, what I took from it at age 18 was move to Israel. When I was in high school in Israel, my cousins were at the time joining the army. Join your cousins and make sure that Israel is safe, but also make sure that it's just. And that was my goal when I joined the army back in 2008. I served as a shooting instructor for infantry soldiers. I worked with somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 soldiers over the course of my service. And I myself also served multiple times in the West Bank, which even though I wasn't a combatant, is very, very common for what we call supporters of combatants, or in my specific position, a shooting instructor. And so I did things like guard settlements, and I did this all with this concept of let's make sure that Israel is safe, but we also have to make sure that Israel is just. And one thing I found both during my service and that I realized more and more as I was training soldiers is that I would train soldiers for war. I mean, really, I would train them for war. We would have these full-length cardboard soldiers that we would shoot on, and they were soldiers. They were wearing uniforms, they had helmets, they were pointing a gun at you, and we would shoot at them. And then you go and you finish your training. For some soldiers, it's 8 months. For some soldiers, it's 12 months. For some, it's 14 months. It depends on all infantry, but depends if they're in a special unit or a regular unit. And pretty much every single one of them at some point, just like I did some weekends, ended up in the West Bank. And what we found is that the people that we would see through our scopes were not soldiers, they were civilians. And there's no aha moment. There's no, and now we're gonna go police civilians, right? That moment doesn't exist, but rather we are basically have gone through this training and we see everyone as a potential threat. We don't know what's gonna happen, right? There's also, of course, it's a very complex situation. You have settlers, you have Israelis who are living in the West Bank. You have Israelis who are living in the West Bank, right? And our main role is to make sure that those Israelis are safe. Yeah, and it doesn't matter if you're based in Hebron or you're based in the northern West Bank near Nablus and the Jordan Valley, where I did a lot of guarding of settlements. Right? That's the main goal. And what connects us in breaking the silence, and today we're about 1,500 testifiers who have given testimony since 2004, is basically coming out of that experience and realizing that the commands that we were given and the overall mission can't be done morally. Not because we're bad people, not because we're bad apples, not because we take pleasure necessarily in arresting people and stopping and frisking and going into people's houses in the middle of the night, but because that's the commands over and over and over again. And through that, at Breaking the Silence, we realized that there's no moral way to carry out this mission, which is inherently controlling millions of people through our military, right? Now, the basics of when we say occupation in Breaking the Silence is that in 1967, you have the Six-Day War. I'm sure you've all learned about it like a bunch of times. And in the Six-Day War, Israel captures a bunch of land. Some of that land is what we see on this map, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. There's also the Golan Heights. We're not going to talk about that today. There's also at the time the Sinai Peninsula, which was returned to Egypt later on as part of the peace agreement. But today we're going to focus mainly on the West Bank. And the law of the land since June 1967 and until, what day are we today? The 29th? And until June 29th, 2023, at this exact hour, is that the law of the land is the Israeli military, right? That is the end-all be-all when it comes to sovereignty. It's supposed to be temporary sovereignty. But that is the end-all be-all when it comes to sovereignty in the West Bank, yeah? You have other groups that are functioning there, like the Palestinian Authority, and they really do have a lot of authority power, especially in major Palestinian cities. But the law of the land is still that of the Israeli military. And if we want to go into those areas at any point, we go into those areas. And 100% we are in one of those areas right now. And I say confident saying 100%, which I don't usually do, because the situation is so tense in the West Bank right now that we definitely have more troops than usual, and you can read about it, and there's no way that we're not somewhere in Area A right now, right? It's a constant. How many people live in the West Bank? Does anyone know how many Palestinians live in the West Bank? 1.5 million, up a bit. 2.5 million Palestinians live in the West Bank. And how many Israelis live in the West Bank, or what we generally call settlers? 700,000, you're close. You gave them 200,000 extra. There's about 500,000 Israelis who live. It does not include Jerusalem. It does not include Jerusalem. If you include Jerusalem, you get another 350,000 settlers living in East Jerusalem. And so it's, in terms of actual settlers, yeah, we're close to 1 million now. I'm specifically talking about the West Bank, so made that separation, but you are right. That's also settlements. And so this is, yeah, like French Hill, exactly. And so this is the situation in the West Bank. As far as soldiers go, generally, and I don't know what the exact number is right now, it's not like the most public of information, what's going on at this exact moment, but generally there's about 12,000 to 20,000 soldiers in the West Bank at any given moment. Not all of them are necessarily combatants, right? I think going into the next part of this talk, we can understand that there's a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank. There's a lot of settlers that we need to safeguard. There's not a lot of soldiers. There's way less soldiers than I think we would maybe imagine if we just were to take a guess at the numbers. Yeah. Cool. Okay. I'm like talking a lot, so I'm going to skip a little bit, and I'm just going to give one example before going on and kind of explaining our day-to-day, what we do under this concept of deference, but I want to just give one example of you guys don't see there, of a pretty standard mission in the West Bank, yeah? And this mission is basically doing a check post. This is a check post. They're also known as flying checkpoints. It's the same thing. And so a lot of times when people think of the West Bank, you think of checkpoints, you think of like this huge built up permanent checkpoint area, right? Those exist. There are 22 of them that separate between the West Bank and Israel. Most permanent checkpoints actually exist within the West Bank. Most of them separate between Palestinian communities and Palestinian communities. And then in addition to that, you have these things called flying checkpoints or check posts that you set up randomly. And it's a pretty daily mission, meaning not every soldier necessarily does it every day, but not a day goes by in the West Bank where someone's not doing it, right? And it's exactly what you see. You basically kind of stop the road, you put down like spikes so that you can't just go ahead, and then you stop the cars, right? Sometimes it's at the level of the commander in the field to decide to do a checkpoint, a flying checkpoint. Sometimes it's at the level of the officer, either the officer in the field or officers not in the field, meaning higher up officers. And then you basically stop and check people's IDs, right? Sometimes you have a specific ID you're checking for. In most of our testimonies, we find that there's no specific ID that they're looking for. If they deem someone to be suspicious, they'll call the situation room, check their ID, and then either let them go or arrest them. And this is an example from one of our testifiers. Little Karam area in 2016, right? You guys don't see what I see? Okay. So he reads, or he says, "There's a story which in my eyes is the weirdest, most messed up, and reflects the reality of ruling over civilians for the sake of ruling." Now I say stop for a second. The army doesn't do it out of evil to control human beings. It's just that in order to maintain the situation, which is military rule in the territories, it's what has to be done. We'd enter villages. For example, we'd enter Zeta. Zeta is a small village without many people. We enter the village center, and we set up a flying checkpoint. Traffic spikes, a few vehicles. We drive up a small hill and provide cover. What we do is check vehicles. What is checking vehicles? To look in the trunk, to check their IDs, and let them drive away. Now, I don't really know what I'm checking for. They told me to check IDs, but they didn't give the number of a suspect in the village. And even if Ahmed Yassin was there, I wasn't told about it. Nothing. Check them. Check their vehicle. Now, what exactly am I supposed to check in his vehicle? He's driving in his own village. Even if there were knives there, it's farmers can work with them. They're not even in Israel. So you enter the village, you check them, and I don't even know what I'm checking. You cause a traffic jam in the village of about 200, 300 residents. You disrupt their daily life. After 2 hours, you just pack up and leave. So what do you check? That's the interviewer asking. Nothing. I don't know what I'm checking at all. As the commander, I'm telling you, as the person responsible for this situation, I had no idea what I was doing. And this is this isn't a very dramatic testimony. There's nothing really major going on here. This is a pretty daily testimony or daily thing that we do in the West Bank. And I think one thing that's interesting is, so I have my experiences in the West Bank. Every single person of the 1,500 testifiers who have given us testimonies have their experience. There are also a bunch of other soldiers who have not yet given us testimony who have their experience. And I would say that one for one, almost, Israelis who have served in the occupied territories, may it be the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or the Gaza Strip, has an idea of what the occupation means. That doesn't necessarily mean that they, again, politically agree or disagree with my analysis or the things that I'm saying, but they have an idea of what it means to do a flying checkpoint, right? Or to go into a house, or to make an arrest, right? Or to sterilize a road, which means have a road that Arabs can't walk on, right? The Palestinians can't walk on, specifically. But also Breaking the Silence has been around since 2004, and around 2010, for the first time, we gathered all of our testimonies and opened them up and said, what are the themes of the occupation? How does the occupation function, right? And we actually learned a lot from that process. We're still learning constantly. And a lot of things that I think up until that moment we thought had one rationale. When we put them all together, we realized it had a different rationale. And it makes sense because if you are one soldier, for example, most of my experience in the West Bank is guarding settlements, yeah? Another soldier main experience in the West Bank is breaking up protests. Another is setting up checkpoints, going into houses. And so you might know one area and what you did, and you'll know it much, much better than anyone who didn't serve there. But we have testimony from the past, at this point, 23 years, from all different areas and from pretty much every single unit that has served in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so we can see trends. And I think the one I really debated this morning. I sat like at my brother's house where I'm staying, because I was asking you, do you guys, did you see what's going on? And there's all these new outposts, and there's settler violence, and we could take this talk in so many directions and bring it back to what's going on politically in Israel right now. But I think I would lead us astray if I didn't focus on the heart of the issue. And I think a lot of times we look at things like settler violence and we want to believe it's the heart of the issue because here are these kind of like ragtag violent people, instead of seeing the system itself, which is not to give them the okay, it's not okay, but I think there's more of a heart of the matter here that we can focus on, and that is this concept of prevention, or maybe a better English translation would be deterrence. If anyone knows Hebrew, sikul. Yeah. And the idea is that the main thing that we're doing in the occupied territories is to deter terror, right? It makes sense. Been a lot of attacks recently. We don't want people to get harmed. We don't want innocent people, of course, to get harmed. We don't want anyone to get harmed, but like we also don't want random attacks on innocent civilians. And so we're doing our best to prevent that. And I think it's important to note in this that the army, in the end of the day, has a mission given to it by the state, by the government. And that's occupy, control. You're the law of the land right now, right? The army then has to figure out the best way to do that. And there's, I think, two things that are important to understand about how we do deterrence. The first, we're going to swing back around to it at the end of this talk, and that's the concept of a long-term occupation. And that is, we're functioning in the West Bank right now as an army that has absolutely no concept of ending its mission. Right? Now, I'm going to give this example for a second, but it's not to say that I think what happened in Afghanistan or Iraq is good, but a lot of the missions were designed in those two places with the concept that at some point the US will pull out. That doesn't exist here, right? It did exist a little bit in between the first and second Intifada, by the way, during the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. It didn't exist before that, and it hasn't existed since the early 2000s, since the breakout of the second Intifada in October 2000. Right? And that really affects the way that we function in the West Bank, and we're gonna like dig deep into that in a second. The second thing is that when you put all of our testimonies together, you see that though the idea is to deter terror, and we definitely have examples of deterring specific terror attacks, we do have testimonies of that, or arresting someone who has blood on their hands, most of the things that we call deterrence are kind of a bunch of different missions, which basic idea is to deter terror in the general population, right? Meaning we don't know when someone is going to grab a knife and harm, we don't know when a Palestinian will grab a knife and harm an Israeli. And so our way of dealing with it is trying to deter everyone from doing that, okay? And I'm gonna kind of go into this example with the example of arrests. Because I think that it's an example that shows kind of the scale or the scale of what I'm talking about, of what things fall under prevention or deterrence. So arrests. We do a lot of arrests in the West Bank. We do arrests in the West Bank on a daily basis. Not all arrests necessarily lead to an indictment, right? A lot of arrests are people who are arrested and then let go at some point. And so if we start from the most, when we think of trying to either prevent an attack or even arrest someone who's already committed an attack and we want to arrest them and hold them accountable and bring justice to the situation. So we do have arrests like that, right? And in that case, we have really, really good information about the person who either is going to commit an attack or committed an attack. We have our best forces out there making those arrests, groups like Duvdevan, which in English means cherry, but is a specific force who is trained to work in the West Bank, and a lot of them dress up as civilians and basically are able to do better anti-terror work. Yeah. That's and so those type of arrests exist, especially around the second Intifada. We had a lot of arrests like that, right? We have a soldier who served in Duvdevan between 2006 and 2008. So he served right after the Intifada ended. And he said, we always wanted to make more arrests, but we arrested the most wanted terrorist, and then we arrested the next most wanted terrorist, and then the next most wanted terrorist, until we got to a point where we didn't really have most wanted terrorists to arrest anymore. So we went down a tier. And then we arrested all of them, and then we went down a tier, right? And that's what we're seeing, is that the majority of the arrests that are being made in the West Bank are not these arrests with really high level information. It does exist, yeah? I mean, we have great information. It does exist, but it's not the majority. The majority, when you have, in Hebrew you call a gdud, and I'm gonna forget like how to say it in English, but I think it's a company. No, a company is a pluga, doesn't matter. Whatever's one up a company, if anyone here, a regiment. We'll go with that. About 800 soldiers, yeah? Your average regiment, they make arrests on a pretty daily basis. It depends where they are. If you're in a place like Hebron, so you're in a Palestinian city with a settlement inside of it, there's a lot of friction daily. Arrests are being made, not necessarily every minute, but arrests are being made, pretty regularly, right? In places where Israelis and Palestinians are further away from each other, arrests are often being made less often. But either way, none of these groups are trained to catch like the most wanted, right? We have Duvdevan for that, but they're making arrests. And so a lot of our testimonies evolve around what, as soldiers, we called bamba arrests or snack arrests. Bamba is like this, it's like Cheetos, but it's peanut butter. And it's a snack arrest. It's an arrest we make like ala derech, like on the way as we're fulfilling our jobs, right? And so to give an example, we have a soldier, let me see if I have, from 2010 in Hebron, and gave a full testimony about going to arrest a Palestinian in Hebron who was accused of stealing pens like that you write with. And they get to his house and there's like 4 or 5 boxes of pens and they arrest the guy, right? And so snack arrests are a really, really common type of arresting people. It's often children. As soldiers, we did Breaking the Silence together with another organization, Yeshtin, did research about this a couple of years ago. Like, what's the minimum age in which you can arrest a kid? I can say personally, I was never given any sort of information about that, and that's the overall response that we got. Over 90% of soldiers said, we just weren't told anything. What's the youngest kid we can arrest, yeah? We did have a few soldiers who their company commanders would make that decision in the field, right? But in terms of a kind of high up decision, we see kids being arrested regularly. There are currently hundreds of kids sitting in military jails. And so that's another type of arrest. Another type of arrest is a pressure arrest. A pressure arrest is when you know someone, or not you know someone. We have information about someone, we want to arrest him, like a Hamas operative, for example, but we don't exactly know how to get him, so we arrest members of his family or friends, right? We basically put pressure on the person that we're trying to arrest by arresting someone who is not involved in the situation. To give an example, in 2014, I'm sure you all remember Protective Edge, the war that happened in Gaza. Yeah, but maybe you also remember there was 3 weeks before that where we were looking for 3 boys that had been kidnapped in the West Bank. It was a really, really difficult time in the country. It was a really upsetting time. And there was a mission called My Brother's Keeper. And that mission was to bring the boys home. Unfortunately, they were found murdered at the end of this mission, unfortunately. And days later, Protective Edge, the war with Gaza, broke out. But during that time, a lot of that mission was focused around Hebron, which so it was focused around Hebron, which is in, like, you can see the southern part of the West Bank. Here. And then in this whole area, you had this other mission being carried out. And for those of you, did anyone here besides you guys go on a tour with Bensi in Hebron? Okay, so Bensi was part of this mission called Cleaning the Stables. And Cleaning the Stables was a mission that was happening that was not discussed publicly while My Brother's Keeper was happening, and its purpose was to clear out any type of Hamas operatives, relatives, connections in the West Bank. Yeah, and that was a lot of the pressure that ended up seemingly leading to the more violence that then occurred with Gaza, right? The operation that occurred with Gaza. And we have a soldier here, not Bensi, from the Nachal Brigade in 2014, from that moment, who says, there's a lot of people that you'd normally not arrest like that, and it was clear that many more people than usual were being arrested. Anyone who in any sort of way was a Hamas supporter, anyone whose CV had the word Hamas in it in any way, he'd be arrested. If not remanded, then at least questioned. There were also a whole lot of searches conducted. There was really this feeling now that we had an opportunity to do what in normal times we didn't have legitimacy to do, especially with regard to Hamas operatives, their relatives, anything. It was very common. Bensi talks about having, Bensi is someone, for those who weren't on a tour with him, Bensi, up until recently, was our World Jewish Coordinator, and he also served in the Nachal Brigade, in a different brigade, in 2014. And they talked about how they would do multiple arrests a night during this time, and a lot of them were fear arrests, right? And so that's another type of arrest, which is starting to bring us, even if there's some information on someone, including one person that Bensi talks about, is someone that they arrested who hadn't been involved in Hamas for years. He was like in his 80s. They joked about arresting the grandpa, right? And so now we're starting to see, we're getting a bit farther away from this very clear information that we have on someone that we want to arrest, right? The next type of arrest is mass arrests. And these are pretty common. They've become quite common in the past 20 years. And a mass arrest is, I think, probably more or less what it sounds like. You arrest many people at once. And so usually, just to give kind of an example, let's say you're in an urban situation. So it would be like shutting off a street in Hebron, right? Maybe someone threw rocks from that street, shut off the whole entire street, and arrest all of the men between the ages of 13, 14, 15, up until the ages of something like 40, 45, 50, right? And then arrest all of those men and take them away. Or don't take them away anywhere, but kind of dry, what we call in the army, dry them out on the side. Just kind of leave them there for minutes or hours, right? And in 2010, we have a testimony that I personally find to be a difficult testimony, in this village of Hares, which is in the northern, kind of like center north part of the West Bank, where the soldiers were told that there were young guys, probably children or youth or teenagers, who were throwing stones at cars. Now, throwing stones at cars is dangerous. I think that's obvious. But they didn't catch them, right? And so in the middle of the night, the whole entire company went into the whole village of Hares at 3 a.m. and basically were given the command to go into every single house and arrest every single man between the ages of 15 and 45. When we arrest people, we blindfold them with like flannel, and we use zip ties to bind their hands behind their backs, and then brought them to the local school. The testifier talks about, people waking up and basically being taken in their pajamas. One thing I always think about, even though it doesn't actually say it in the testimony, but this is taking place in a school. So you can assume that the kids didn't go to school that day, and also having just been witness to their fathers and brothers being arrested, and then they were interviewed by the Shin Bet, by our informant kind of like group in Israel, organization, not informant organization, the like intelligence. Thank you. And they were kept there for 12 hours. After around 7 hours, some of them who had complained that their zip ties were very tight, their zip ties were let go. Either they were moved to the front or they were completely released. Our testifier tells us that in some of them, being taken to the bathroom were hit and kicked while in the bathroom. I can even say, those people who were detained wanted to go to the bathroom, and the soldiers who took them to the bathroom just beat them up, cursed them for no reason. They weren't being rude without a reason that would give them legitimacy to beat. Obviously, throwing stones is dangerous, definitely at cars on a highway. I don't condone, but I don't think it would be possible to imagine sitting in DC that someone used this type of violence and then your whole entire neighborhood is being taken over. And in the middle of the night, someone coming into your house, often face masks or paint, multiple soldiers coming in, and you're waking up often with a gun towards your bed. And that's a mass arrest. It's far away from the type of deterrence that we're talking about when we're talking about having specific information about someone. The last type of arrest I'm going to talk about, and then I'll finish with protests, is a mock arrest. And I'm going to let Nadav explain it.
כשבעצם רוצים לייצר איזושהי פעילות, נגיד אם יש לנו לילה בלי פעילות, שלא קורה בו כלום, שאין איזה התראה או משהו כזה, עושים מעצר דמה. מה זה מעצר דמה? כמו מעצר רגיל, שזה מעצר רגיל, אנחנו מגיעים לבית, אנחנו סוגרים עליו, וכל הרחובות מסביב, ואם יש כריזה, צועקים צאו מהבית, או זורקים רימוני הלם, או עושים בלגן של מעצר, עוצרים מישהו, אז מעצר דמה, הכל אותו דבר, כשבוחרים בית שהוא לא... שאין בו אף אחד לזה. כאילו יש בו משפחה, אין בו מישהו שצר רוצה לעצור. מבטאים לראש גם שאין שם איזה שוטר פלסטיני, או איזשהו נשק, או איזה מישהו שהוא מודיע של הצבא, או... שזה יהיה סתם בן אדם. ופה מגיעים באמצע הלילה, ועושים מתנהלים כאילו זה מעצר רגיל. שגם זה מצחיק, גם לפעמים יוצאים אנשים כאלה, לא מבינים כאילו מה יוצאים אנשים תוך בית, שכאילו עוזרים, אבל לא מבינים מה קורה.
So mock arrests or fake arrests, it's the same thing. There's one group that I worked with a lot in the army called Kfir. They're an infantry group who specifically trains in order to function in the West Bank. And actually their training base is in the West Bank, which every time that I would go there as a soldier, it's like when I was guarding settlements, I understood I was in the West Bank, but when I went to their base to train them, I didn't quite understand that at the time. It took me years to realize that, because there's no clear line of what is the green line. But anyway, we have multiple testimonies of soldiers from the last years who basically, as part of finishing training, do live practices on villages near their base. Meaning it's become part of the training regiment, at least for this group. It's possible it's happening with other groups, but that's the groups that's the soldiers that we have testimony about that. And on one hand, Kfir is considered to be a pretty brutal brigade or regiment. On the other hand, they're not choosing for this to be a part of their training. This is what the training is, right? And I think with mock arrest, we can see that it's very, very far away from arresting someone who we have specific information on them. But all of these things fall under this concept of deterrence, right? Because the idea of deterrence is that we're doing anything that will prevent or deter a Palestinian resident of the West Bank at some point from committing an attack, right? And these blurred lines are very real within kind of our thinking in the moment as well. Yeah, it's not just blurred lines of, well, this concept of arrest is, it's so vague at this point. It involves so many different types of arrest. But, when we go around in the West Bank, no one is innocent. Basically, we have, and you hear this now in the Israeli media very regularly. If you know Hebrew, you can catch it quite easily, though it's so ingrained to us as a society that we don't talk about it that much, but you have involved and uninvolved. You have people who are involved in terror and people who are uninvolved in terror, right? But no one is exactly given the grace of innocent, definitely not innocent until proven guilty, right? And so just to give an example of that, in Hebron in October, there was a very serious terror attack in the city. One Israeli was killed, another Israeli was very badly wounded. He's, to my understanding, still in a coma. And there was a Palestinian who was innocent, who was in no way connected to the situation, who was also harmed and wounded. And the media said there's a terror attack, one Israeli was killed, one Israeli was harmed, and also an uninvolved Palestinian was harmed. Or actually, I think there's an uninvolved Arab in a lot of places. But the concept being, even when this person was a victim of an attack, right, the wording that we use is uninvolved, because basically the idea is everyone's a potential threat. You're uninvolved until you're involved. And things like mock arrests or mass arrests, when we don't really know who we're arresting, right? Or to bring it back to that first testimony I shared about then kind of going in and setting up a checkpoint and not really knowing why they're doing it, but disturbing the daily lives of 200, 300 people in the village. This all falls under to this umbrella that we call making our presence felt. And for those of you who were in Hebron, you definitely heard this, right? And the concept of making our presence felt is that we can't be everywhere all the time, right? If we're thousands of soldiers, there are millions of Palestinians, those numbers are so unequal. The way that we can exert control over time is by giving Palestinians a feeling that they never know where we're going to show up. They never know how we're going to show up. They don't know under what capacity. They don't know for how long, right? And so even if tonight, if you're Palestinian, and even if tonight no soldier walks through your front door, you can never really know that when you go to sleep, right? And that's the basic way that we exert control in the West Bank. Again, a lot of times we'll hear the stories of an individual soldier who does something horrible, who beats someone up at a checkpoint, right? Those stories exist, but it would be false to think that that's the problem in the West Bank, because our mission is to disturb people's daily lives. And that disturbance, that disorder that we create, for us, that's creating order, right? And so we call it sometimes Afkadat Nochachut, making our presence felt, is the most common way that it's being said, like in the past 5 years, 10 years even. That was used in my time as well. But other things are, show them who's the boss, la'arot mi ba'al habayit, show them who's the owner of the house, right? Which, for those of you who read and are really into what's going on, so you have Ben Gvir, who today is the security minister, and he's responsible for all of the police in Israel and in the West Bank. And his campaign was, we need to show them who's the head of the house, right? The same exact thing that we're told as soldiers that we need to do in the West Bank. Or make sure Palestinians have a feeling of being chased, or have a feeling that we're breathing down their neck, right? And this is the mission. So much of the missions is randomness. And then a lot of the missions, when you go out for 8 hours and you're just told patrol, they're vague, right? But that vagueness means that you don't necessarily how you're going to spend your 8 hours. How could Palestinians possibly know how you're going to spend your 8 hours, right? I could go into a bunch of other examples of this, but I realize that we're short on time and I've already even gone a bit over. But I do want to just bring it back to protests, because I think it's really important. And I think also it's something that I personally feel as someone who grew up in the US, protesting is such a basic right, that we have in the US. And it's an incredibly important right. It's, freedom of speech is obviously a pillar of democracy. I'm sure that everyone in this room agrees on that. And protests in the West Bank, are actually not legal. And in 1967, early on in 1967, actually, so, I mean, the occupation only started halfway through 1967, but like early on in the occupation, those first few months, you have a lot of military orders that were passed, right? And the way that the West Bank functions overall is if in Israel you have laws, kind of like how in the US you have laws, in the West Bank you don't have laws. You have a series of temporary military orders. You have the high commander of the Central Command. He is the highest military commander in the West Bank. He writes military orders. And those kind of combination of orders are this temporary sovereignty that at this point has been going on for over 55 years in the West Bank. Right? And these military orders have to be renewed depending on the order. It can be sometimes once a day, it can be once a week, it can be once every 6 months, it could be once a year. But it's rare that you have a military order that lasts for longer than a year, because then it's really hard to say that it's temporary, right? So one of them is Military Order 101. And Military Order 101 says that 10 Palestinians cannot gather to have a conversation that is political or do anything political together, right? So for example, protests. But even just Palestinians technically getting together in a park and talking about who they want to vote for in local municipal elections, which do occur, is technically illegal by the standards of the occupation. Now, that doesn't mean that there are never protests. There are protests all the time in the West Bank, but it means that there aren't legally protests in the West Bank. And it's funny, you know, sometimes like we'll talk to soldiers, right? And a lot of times I'm talking to soldiers who are serving now. And I ask them, especially in Hebron, because you have protests in Hebron every Friday. You say, oh, like, have you been in a protest yet? Like, have you broken up a protest? Because someone's breaking up those protests every Friday. And they say, no, I haven't broken up any protest. I've broken up disturbance of order, hafsad, afarot seder in Hebrew. We don't use the word protest in the army. We use the word disturbance of order. And so if the order is being disturbed, we make it order. We put order back in, right? And I want to give this example to end us and then kind of bring it back to what's going on in Israel with Kdumim. And one of the reasons why I like this example is because I have family in Kdumim and I've spent a lot of time there. And it's a pretty old settlement. It's a pretty established settlement. And so I'm sorry for the people on Zoom. I hope you can hear me, but I'm going to walk to the map for. Oh, can I take this with me? Okay. So you have here Kdumim. Okay, this is like an old established settlement. In the early 2000s, you have the extension of Kdumim, which was expanded, right? And then you also have this village, which is called Kfar Kadum. Yeah, and this is a Palestinian village. It's been there documented for hundreds of years. And the way that people in Kfar Kadum get to Nablus is that they basically go down this road, and then they connect here and they go to Nablus. It's a village that's kind of like in the suburbs or the periphery of Nablus, which is the big city. They're irrelevant if they can't get to Nablus, right? Traditionally, what would happen is that they would provide food and, goods to Nablus. I mean, that's why these villages kind of popped up, right? Is to support the big city, kind of like how Jersey used to like support New York, And because, there's like, it's the Garden State, maybe it's a Philly thing, doesn't matter. Okay, and when the extension is built to Kdumim, the army says it's no longer safe for Kfar Kadum, for people to go down this road. It's a security threat because they're too close to the settlement. You see how close this road comes to the settlement here? It's too close, and so that's inherently a security threat to Israelis, and so the army's not going to let them go there anymore. And so for 20 years, Palestinians haven't been able to drive on that road. And instead they have to take this circuitous route that takes like, at the very least 40 minutes to get to Nablus, which is like a 10, 15-minute drive away, right? By the way, this is all happening in this area of Hawara, which if you're like reading Haaretz, I'm sure like so much violence is taking place in Hawara. And it's exactly examples like this of either new settlements popping up or extensions of settlements popping up, right? And then areas become, it's much, much harder to drive into. Hawara specifically is right next to Nablus, meaning Palestinians have to go through, which it's both a Palestinian city, but also Palestinians have to go through Hawara in most directions in order to get to Nablus, and then all these encroaching settlements that are coming up right now, right? But this has been this way for 20 years. And so every Friday in Kfar Kadum, Palestinians protest so that they can open up their road. Now, it's not a non-violent protest, it's an unarmed protest. No one has guns, but people will throw rocks and people will light up tires and kind of throw them. The reality is that the Palestinians and the soldiers, they never get close to each other, right? Like they're hundreds of meters or hundreds of yards away from each other, right? And so the Palestinians will start walking, the soldiers will start walking towards them using like different means to break up protests. And it's almost, soldiers often kind of describe it as a dance, right? You know exactly what's gonna happen. It happens every single Friday. And I'll share what a soldier from 2014 from Orev Nachal explains about it. And he says, I remember that we would reach a situation in which we got mad and tried to shoot them directly with the Ringo gas, which is a tear gas launcher. To the credit of my commander, he was often angry about that. Not that he did anything. We knew it was forbidden, but you're in a tempest there. You're hit by stones and you find yourself also shooting directly. And you know that the rules are not, but in fact, at some stage you feel that we're not doing anything here. We're being hit by stones, we're shooting all sorts of gas, and they, the demonstrators, don't mind the gas, and you feel hopeless because what are you actually doing here every Friday? And you say, we'll do something, we'll shoot directly at them. If someone throws stones at us, we'll try and hit them directly. It seems very parallel and sensible. And on one hand, these protests are not, they're not I can't go as far to say that they're nonviolent, right? But the reality is we have a group of people here who can no longer access the road, going from their village to a city. And again, I'll use Bensi for those of you who know him, for those of you who don't, he's a great guy, I suggest meeting him. And Bensi, at one point in 2014, he was either the unit before this unit of the testimony I just read or the unit right after the testimony I just read, but he also had spent a lot of time breaking up these protests. And he says that one of the moments that made him question if what he's doing in the West Bank is helping the state of Israel is when one day, it was a Thursday, these protests happened on Friday mornings, they were given the command, him and his unit, and he was in a special unit, so they like arrested a lot of important people over the time of their service, were given the command to go into Kfar Kadum on Thursday night, in the middle of the night, and arrest 12 guys, young guys. Some of them as young as 15, 16, some of them as old as 20, 21, maybe 22, yeah? And then they were gonna hold them, detain them so that they couldn't join the protest the next day, yeah? I'll say quickly from other testimonies and from personal experience and knowledge that a lot of times the people, by the way, in the protests that we're arresting are not the people throwing stones, but they're what we call the main instigator, right? It's the person who has the microphone or the megaphone, right? We're trying to get the organizers. And so they basically went in and got this group who maybe they saw them as the organizers, maybe they saw them as instigators, maybe they saw them as, you know, people who got really close last time, but they detained them. I haven't said this yet, but I think maybe it's obvious at this point. We don't use warrants. If you want to go into a house, you go into a house. You want to arrest someone, you arrest someone. You want to detain them, you detain them. And they went in and they detained these 13 guys from a bunch of different houses in Kfar Kadum. And when they all gathered all of these kind of like youth and young men together, they put them on these like military cars or trucks kind of, and brought them to the base. But at that time, one of the soldiers in the room that Bensi wasn't in told them, yeah, so we went to arrest this guy and his younger brother sucker punched me. And he was fine. They arrested the guy that they wanted to arrest, they left. But then his commander said, well, no, you got sucker punched, you need to go arrest that kid. So then they went and they arrested this like 15-year-old. But all the other guys had already been taken away in a Jeep. It was just a few of them that stayed behind. And so the base is kind of like where they're staying is near Kadumim. And I don't know how well you can tell this picture, but it's walking distance from Kfar Kadum to Kadumim. It's maybe like a mile at the most, right? They're very close to each other. They're just two opposite hills. And so they started walking with this kid blindfolded and handcuffed behind. And when they needed a rest, they kind of lied him, like he just sat on his knees in the middle of this olive grove. No idea where he is. They don't speak the same language. And Bentzi's sitting there thinking, this is what I moved to, he was also a lone soldier. This is what I moved to Israel, and this is defending Israel. They didn't even show up at the protest yet, right? The protest, it hadn't happened. And I think we could potentially focus on, in some moments in these protests, things like throwing rocks or throwing Molotov cocktails, is that what they're called in English? Which are all, they don't happen in every Palestinian protest. There are Palestinian protests that are completely nonviolent, yeah? But they happen in a lot of protests. But the reality is that, first and foremost, these protests are totally illegal. I've been in many, many completely nonviolent protests that were broken up just as brutally. The right to protest doesn't exist. And I think when you look at the basic of what it means to be in the West Bank, it makes sense. Because the army, and I'm not saying that everything the army does is fine or that, the hands are clean, but at the end of the day, the army is being given a mission. There's 2.5 million people here. We want to be here, control it. The reality is you can't control people who don't want you to control them without using violence. Show me an example, right? You can't. And so we use violence over and over and over again. And protesting, regardless of how you protest, is maybe the best example of saying, I'm lifting my head up and I'm gonna resist, right? And so if we're going into people's houses and we're setting up checkpoints and we're stopping and frisking people and we're drying people out on the side on a regular basis to make sure they don't lift their head up, then of course the second that someone lifts their head up, we're going to do that as well. And even harder and even more brutally, right? A year and a half ago, in October of 2021, Benny Gantz, who was the former Minister of Defense in the change government, in the government that was supposed to be the government that can make change, the progressive government. So he declared 6 of the most well-known and regarded Palestinian civil society organizations terror organizations. Yeah, and every country in Europe that was funding the Palestinian Authority said, okay, bring us proof. And after proof couldn't be brought that they had been dealing with terror, all of the European Union has gone back now to funding the Palestinian, not the Palestinian Authority, have gone back to funding these organizations that they were funding previously, right? Meaning there's been no proof of terror. But what is there proof of? A strong civil society where people are lifting their heads up, right? I think it's unsurprising when we look at protests like this in the West Bank that we've come to this moment today when you have both a legal overhaul and attempt to protest that legal overhaul in Israel, which seemingly doesn't have to do with the occupation, right? Right, and you're like, no, but of course it does. Well, yeah, of course it does, but right? But both within the overhaul, the discussion about it is, we want things to be more democratic, right? If things will be more democratic if the ruling country can make easier decisions, right? And those who are on the side of the protest are saying, no, we want our rights, we need a strong court, right? But within the protest itself, it's interesting. There's not a lot of talk about the occupation from the leaders of the protest. There is an anti-occupation bloc within the protest. Breaking the Silence were there with a bunch of other people. I mean, we totally can't take credit for it's like a huge block of organizations and groups and individual activists, and it's really amazing, trying to say, no, of course the occupation is relevant here, because in the end of the day, you can't have on one side of the green line what's inherently a military dictatorship. I know that's harsh language, but kind of all attempts to control the people who have no rights, right? You can go in their houses, you don't need a warrant, you can break up their protests. I know that like, if we were to go through the Bill of Rights, there's one for everyone, right? On a daily basis. And have a strong democracy on our side, on the Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa side of the Green Line, right? You can't have both. A lot of people will say these protests or the legal overhaul is happening in Israel because Netanyahu, who's going under, he's on trial, to make his trial irrelevant, right? But let's look at the people who are creating these protests, who are creating the overhaul. They're people who inherently want to continue controlling the West Bank, want to move towards annexation, which means that the Knesset, which means become a part of Israel, right? Israeli government would be responsible for these areas and not the Israeli military. It's people who are leaders of the settlement movement, right? Levin, Simcha Rotman. And so what we believe is that, of course, you can't really have a true democracy while on one side of the Green Line, the side we've occupied, the West Bank, and everything I'm saying I also think is true with Gaza, but just didn't use that as an example today. We can't have a democracy while we're controlling the lives of millions of people. I'll end and say that I started by saying I joined the army myself because I wanted Israel to be, both a place that was safe for Jews, but also to be just. And after serving in the army and participating in the occupation myself, I realized there's no way to try and fulfill that goal without fighting the occupation and without trying to bring the occupation to an end. There's no question in my mind that the occupation today, and this is what I talk to with every protester when we sit there and talk. We go to the protests and we talk to all our fellow Israelis. If we want to make sure that the legal overhaul comes to a halt, that can only happen with the end of occupation. Because those who want the legal overhaul to happen want to happen so that we can deepen our hold there, right? And I believe that the most Jewish thing that I can do is to bring about this situation to an end. And of course, as an American Jewish community, you have a place in that, you have a say in that. You are a relevant voice in this conversation. And so thank you very, very much for having me. Happy to do questions. Sorry, I went a bit over time.
I have an initial question about breaking the silence itself.
For sure, yeah.
1,500 soldiers you have testimonies from.
Yeah.
And is there a waiting list? It sounds like if there are 20,000 soldiers, between 12 and 20,000 soldiers at a time, but of course it's
right.
A year and a half. What's the waiting list? Because in this amount of time, or 15 or 20 years, maybe many, many, many more soldiers.
Yeah.
So how do you decide who you're going to interview, and what's the system, and what's the backlog in terms of just your system of gathering your own information so you can do your work?
Yeah. So one thing that we've decided principally over the past, I don't know when we made this decision, but it's been this way for years, is we only interview soldiers who served in the past 5 years. That's the first thing, because we want to be relevant. We want to be interviewing people who served relatively recently. And the past 5 years is a good gauge. It's very rare for someone to come and give testimony while they're in service. It does happen, but the reality is that all the things we talked about right now, every so often you get someone, again, Bentzi's a good example, who will be in the middle of his service and be like, what is going on here? But for most people, this concept of everyone's a potential threat, we're protecting the country, that is absolutely alive in us, right? And so people need a moment to leave the situation often, to be able to process what they did, to even want to come and give testimony. We collect about 50 testimonies a year. That's our capacity. We collect not 50 testimonies. We sit with 50 testifiers a year. From there, you do like a 3-hour interview and you'll have multiple testimonies, and then those testimonies you need to verify. And so it's a long process between sitting with someone and getting to a point where we have a concise testimony. So it's about 50 people a year, and we don't have capacity currently to do more than that. So that's our, that's our focus. And then in addition to that, obviously, we're always looking for soldiers who want to give testimony, especially if, we recently, for example, interviewed a soldier. You can see, CNN wrote a piece about this like 2 weeks ago, I think, who was in Hawara when there was a pogrom in Hawara in mid-late February of this year. He was already on his way out of the army, like he was at the very end of his service, and he got to us probably like a month or two later, right? So, so obviously that's information that's happening in almost real time. Which is incredibly important, because one aspect I would say of taking testimonies is, well, a lot of times learn the detail about something only a couple years after it happened, because someone has to come forward and want to give testimony about it, right? I wouldn't go as far to say we have a waiting list. I wish. That would be amazing. But most people, even for people who are willing and interested in giving testimony, it's pretty rare that someone just sends us an email and says, hey, I want to give testimony. Usually testimony happens by somehow getting in touch, like somehow we get in touch with them or they get in touch with us. Either like a friend brings a friend, someone gave testimony and then invites a friend who they know would be willing and interested to do the same, or through our educational work. I don't know if I mentioned this, and I think I didn't mention this, but the two main things we do at Breaking the Silence is we collect testimonies. We have that whole aspect of collecting testimonies, sitting with testifiers, verifying those testimonies and publishing them. And then that becomes the base of our educational work. And for our educational work, we take people to Hebron and the South Hebron Hills, and we work with the most Israelis every year of every kind of anti-occupation organization. And so a lot of our testifiers we get through those types of kind of programming or tours, like students. I mean, that's like gold, like taking students on a tour. It's like half of them served in the occupied territories,
Next question. Thank you so much. When you speak with American Jewish audiences, and I don't know how often you do that, you happen to be in the United States now, so, or I guess maybe many of them are people who are coming to Israel, but how knowledgeable do you think American Jews are about the situation in Israel, and what do you think American Jews can do to help end the occupation or change the situation in Israel?
Fantastic. Okay, so I talk with U.S. Jews. I mean, personally, I talk with U.S. Jews a lot, and also Breaking the Silence, we work with U.S. Jews a lot. Up until recently, I was the director of education at Breaking the Silence, and in addition to me in the department, there was two people who were responsible for reaching out to Israeli audiences and doing educational work with Israeli audiences exclusively, and one who was responsible for U.S., British, etc. Jewry, like worldwide Jewish communities. And so we do a lot of work with U.S. Jewish communities. Also, about once a year to 2 years, we come and do a tour. Like we actually were here in the fall. We didn't come to D.C., so it's nice that I'm here right now. But so we really do a lot of work with Jewish communities. The level of knowledge is very low. I would say that for young people, it is growing. 20-year-olds today know a lot more than 20-year-olds did a decade ago. And I think they're more interested. They have a bit more of a critical eye. But the average person knows very little. I can say that when I did high school in Israel at age 17, that was the first time I saw a map with a green line on it, right? And I grew up in a synagogue that I was active in. I went to Jewish camp. I don't expect them to talk about a Jewish preschool, but I went to Jewish preschool. I was involved in some youth movements. And I went to a synagogue that talked about, everyone around me talked about the two-state solution as this magical option. And no one, until I got to Israel and did, an Israeli history class, no one actually showed me a map with the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem in it. So I think that's a pretty good gauge. if someone who's kind of going through the best that the reform movement has to offer to their youth, and only at age 17 I'm learning what it is, that's a problem, right? And I realize obviously here at this synagogue, you are all doing a lot more than I think probably other synagogues, but you know, the reform movement, and I feel comfortable saying this because I grew up in it, I mean, it's a leading movement in the US, you know? And so much of the connection that we have in our communities to Judaism is centered around Israel. I don't necessarily think that that's a problem, but it does become a problem when it's a totally uncritical look at the situation, right? And you know, interestingly enough, the more religiosity a community has, the less they care about Zionism, right? You go to like modern Orthodox communities in New York. I did a talk in November for Yeshiva University. Every single person there was wearing a kippah. I thought every single question they had was like practical questions about property in Hebron. None of it was, you know, but this, but that, you're lying. None of it was the regular kind of like pushback that we tend to get. And so the level of knowledge is very low. Now, I will say, I recognize completely it's purposeful, right? I mean, I would say that the level of knowledge of your average Jewish American and your level of knowledge of Israelis, it's not that far off. Yeah, Israelis will have more specific understandings of wars, or will remember things like intifadas, like the years better, because they lived through it partially, and if not, it's very strong in our collective memory. But most Israelis wouldn't know about all the stuff, all the examples I gave today, in the same way that most Jewish Americans wouldn't. I would say perhaps the biggest difference, and this is where I think that the American Jewish community struggle to then the second part of the question of how do we, you know, what can we do to help end the occupation, is I do think American Jews, and again, this is not something that I'm specifically saying you all believe or think, but from my experience, I will give Israelis a bit of credit that we realize that we live in an imperfect society, occupation aside. And I think that sometimes with American Jewish communities, we struggle to see that. Israel is you know, this great place that we all go to visit and we love, and it gives us this amazing feeling, but it's also a country, right? And it has to be, you know, it's a country that's part of the UN like any other country, right? It's a country with laws. It's a country where we pay taxes, right? It's a country where, it's a country, you know? And I think that that's a big struggle that US Jewish communities have in then being able to be critical, this feeling of, oh, if I legitimately criticize Israeli policy on the occupation, right, that I'm bursting this bubble, right, or I'm harming Israel, or right. And that's, of course, I think the opposite is true. I think you know, Israel needs some tough love. On a practical level, what can you do? I'm going to give a few things. The first is get involved. Get involved in the NIF, get involved in J Street if that's your thing, get involved in If Not Now or JVP or whatever you think was where your politics align. You know, we don't endorse or not endorse any of them, but get involved. Congress people want to hear from Jewish communities. There is so much talk right now about rising anti-Semitism. Rising anti-Semitism is real. It's very dangerous. And also a lot of times it's being conflated with legitimate critique of Israel, right? If we are not talking out towards our Congress people and senators and politicians on these issues, then we can't expect them to be bold enough to make a strong stance on such a conflicted issue, right? That's a really big thing. The next is, if you have the ability to give monetary support, give monetary support. Give monetary support to Israelis and Palestinians who are on the ground fighting this issue on a daily basis. We really need it. I mean, like, really, really, we need your support. And I promise you, at least talking for Breaking the Silence, though not exclusively, we use that money very well. We open the eyes of people. We get Israelis more involved in being on the ground and fighting the occupation. We are working with our own politicians, right? We're working with diplomats. We're working with communities just like this. And there's other great organizations that are just as worthy of your contribution. And the last thing I'll say, and I think this is a difficult one for American Jewish communities to hear: invite Palestinians, hear Palestinian voices. So often I hear American Jewish communities, and I'll say breaking the silence, we're not supporters of BDS, but we think it's a legitimate group, but we're not that's not our movement, we're not a part of it. I mean, we're boycotted, we're Israeli. We've been boycotted multiple times by Palestinians in different places abroad. But a lot of times we'll hear American Jewish communities say, well, we would love to hear from Palestinians, but they can't support BDS. Almost every Palestinian supports BDS. And it's making it a possibility where we're saying we want to hear these other voices, we want to hear these narratives, and we want to understand how people are being impacted on the ground. For every testimony I shared with you, there's someone's life behind there. And I can't tell it. And so figuring out how to put that aside, so it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the person says, doesn't mean you have to agree with the political ways that person is taking, but we're stopping ourselves from hearing the conversation. And I think as a community, we need to do more. The last thing I'll actually say, sorry, but the other thing that came up that involves, even if you don't, I know BDS, it's a hot topic, and it's a very conflicted topic. In the US specifically, I doubt this is happening in DC because you're DC, but I'll say it anyway in case some of you are from Virginia or Maryland or I don't know. You have on a state level and on local levels these BDS laws that are being passed, right? But it's not really just BDS. It's even if you're just critiquing the Israeli occupation, right? You're just critiquing what's going on in the West Bank or in Gaza, people can be fired from their jobs for that, right? Besides the fact that completely goes against free speech in the US and from that point should not be legal, that's not the way. That is very much those who want to annex the West Bank, deepen the occupation, are working at a very local level in US politics. And if you care about ending the occupation, we need to be at the local level as well.
Is going back to the courts.
Oh, it is? I actually wasn't updated about that.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm going to pass around a piece of paper, which I was supposed to do at the beginning. If you want to get emails, I'm getting the Breaking the Silence email list. Put down your name and your email address in a way that's legible.
Yeah.
This is going to be the last question because you mentioned something, and you were at Yeshiva University.
Yeah.
So on our last trip, we arranged, with the help of another group, while we were in Hebron, we met with a student, a Yeshiva Bracha from the Hebron Yeshiva.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you about your experience at Yeshiva University. He spoke about, in terms of studying, he'd been there for several years, studying at the Hebron Yeshiva. He used the terminology of Avraham Avinu as if Avraham was literally his father. That's how close he felt, I don't even want to say spiritually, physically, to studying at this, living in Hebron, studying in this place. And when you just said that the students at Yeshiva University were asking about getting property in Hebron, tell us about that. In other words, because it sounds to me like they are first cousins to the student that we went to. Yes, exactly.
No, I should clarify. They weren't asking about getting property in Hebron. What I meant was, so you have all these different properties that have basically been stolen in Hebron. Right now, they've been stolen in a bunch of different bureaucratic legal ways. The most recent one was stolen yesterday. Meaning there's a new outpost in Hebron as of yesterday. And I know that because someone was giving a tour today and walked into it, and we can see it. I mean, yesterday was the first time at least that someone noticed. It's possible it's been there probably not longer than a week though, right? Some of these houses the papers of selling them have been falsified. Some of them, you'll have a bunch of cousins who own a house and one will sell their 7%, but the other 93% don't sell it, right? And the courts will say you can move in, right? There's a bunch of different examples. You have a whole entire example of a house that was never sold. Settlers during the Second Intifada squatted in it. The courts have told them on 7 different occasions under 7 different reasonings that they have to leave, and they still haven't left. And so at Yeshiva University, I think probably what was going on is that they're getting all of this information. Oh, Bet Lean, Bet Rachel, the Red House, Beit Shalom. And they're asking, wait a minute, but when I was at Yeshiva, when in Israel, I went and stayed at the Red House. What's the legal situation there? I'll also say the people that I was talking to specifically also, they were law students, right? So they're really, but they were really asking like legal specific questions in really like trying to understand the situation, right? They weren't, now I'm not surprised that you also met someone who was saying, Avraham Avinu, that's our house, or that's our home. He's my spiritual father. But ultra orthodoxy and modern orthodoxy in the U.S., you have, and I'm not saying that it doesn't exist in the Reform movement, but it's centered around mitzvot. It's not centered around Israel. Right? I know a lot of people who are modern Orthodox who they say, yeah, they don't dislike Israel. They probably feel some connection to it, but it just was never a central thing in their frameworks. Yeah. And in the Reform and conservative and other Jewish communities, it absolutely is, right? Which again is in and of itself not necessarily. It's not that I'm saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but on one hand, Jewish communities abroad are not responsible for the acts of Israel. On the other hand, if we're, and I saw you have like the Declaration of Independence, right, in the front. If the community is saying we are strong, active supporters of Israel, then you're putting yourself in a position also to either be supportive, even if it's passively, but also actively. Where is the community's money going to, right? And what do our maps show? And what are we learning about? What are we teaching our kids in the school programs in middle school and in high school? Or we're dealing with it critically, right? And that's a decision that communities have to make. And even if communities say we're not political, that's obviously, this is DC, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, that's a decision. Right. And so I know we have to end, so I'll maybe end on this point in saying, by having this conversation here tonight is certainly making a decision that it is something you care about. It is something that you want to deal with. And it's a much larger step than a lot of communities in the US have taken. It's certainly not, the only one. We talk to synagogues every time we come, but I do think this voice is growing. I think you're part of a growing movement. And I want to say that, what I always tell Israelis when I finish a tour and everyone's just like totally bummed out is we don't have the right to be bummed out. We don't have the right to feel hopeless. The situation is not static, and the occupation will end. And so every single one of us has the opportunity to leave this evening and think about this occupation is going to end. Some people here are younger, some are older. I believe the occupation is going to end in pretty much everyone who's sitting here lifetime. What did I do to help end it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we will continue to support as a community and individually Breaking the Silence, and we hope to see you on the other side in Israel. That would be great. And thank you all for being with us, and thank you all you there on the Zoom. Take care.